The day that humanity was granted audience before the Universal Council was an auspicious day. They had filled the Milky Way and penetrated the dark space between islands of stellar light, and in doing so had found a standing invitation. "You have conquered the stars," it said, "and can now travel between galaxies with ease. Come before us and take your place at our side." The event was momentous. A newly intergalactic species joining the collective didn't happen every century. There are many stories told of that assembly, of the Council, of concepts that wowed the humans and how the humans, in return, humbled other species. This is not one of those stories. "Order!" called an elderly appearing gentleman. He was Kursuk, the patron god of the world beneath. Like them, he stood on 4 legs, and from his torso were 3 arms on the right side and a larger one on the left. The right arms all held ceremonial polearms, which he banged on the floor in a staccato to silence those assembled. His left arm was empty, according to the world beneath. It was in his left arm that he held the souls of the dead and judged their deeds. He was far from the only god here that represented justice. Almost all of them did, to some extent, reflective of the species and galaxies they stood for. But he was among the oldest here, and from a species that valued oration as well, so he was happy to lead such conclaves. "On this day," he proclaimed, "the humans of the Milky Way galaxy made contact. And just as they have been summoned, so have we summoned their god." Kursuk opened his hand to the small figure seated in the front row. The Milky Way god was a puny one, looking around the grand hall in what must have been an awe. But Kursuk did his best not to judge, and focused instead on the well-practiced speech that he had delivered so many times before. "When deities meet, the result can be disastrous, for us even more so than the mortals. It is their way to die, and while we mourn their passing, we accept it as the ever-turning wheel of life." He gestured with a halberd towards one of the wings of the chamber, acknowledging the half-dozen galactic gods gathered there, whose favoured appearances were more literal interpretations of a wheel. "But when gods meet, it ends in a death much more impactful than that of any single mortal. A species creates a multitude of gods in its infancy, and as it fractures and rejoins, the gods unite. Sometimes it is a pantheon that rules over a species on their cradle. Then they venture to the stars and again fracture, and again reunite, sometimes absorbing the gods of other species that rise to life in the same galaxy." The assembled divine paid varying degrees of attention. Those that had heard this before were split between those who held it with reverence and those who were bored, and while some of the newer gods' eyes were glazed over in nostalgia, as they recalled the relatively recent time when they had sat where the small human gods sat now. "And over time," Kursuk continued, "the gods merge. Pantheons simplify as fewer followers cling to them. A god of justice merges with a god of the harvest, as a just people will see their efforts in agriculture duly rewarded. The god of the sea falls next, as the sea is truly just water, and that is part of the harvest." He gestured expansively with his 4 arms. "This is not the only way it happens. It is only how it happened with me. All of you have faced similar journeys from a multitude of past lives to your single form now. But by the time a species has crossed the intergalactic void, they have set in their ways. It is unlikely that they would voluntarily abandon their religion, even when faced with others, at least not entirely." He raised a spear to Prefui, a large hexaped towards the front. They were one of the few gods that had managed to absorb the god of another galaxy, and were eyeing the Milky Way god hungrily. Kursuk felt some regret as the divinationary part of him glimpsed a potential future for the new god, but he continued. "It happens, certainly, but that is the exception rather than the rule." He put on his best grandfatherly smile to comfort the human god. By the time our mortals have reached across galaxies, they have established their religion, and we are safe to come together, to meet, to share our experiences and perhaps learn a thing or two to assist our flock." The human god smiled, perhaps comforted. Prelfrey smiled for a different reason. Kurzuk pressed on. "As the mortals speak," Kurzuk said, gesturing to the lower dimension on which the less conceptual beings existed, "they are welcoming humanity to the void. They are offering wisdom, and they are judging them as defenders of the Milky Way. Intergalactic conquest is somewhat more common. If a god dies at the intergalactic stage, it is because their followers have died, or been forcibly converted. Though so many of us possess gifts of prophecy, these things are still uncertain. And so we now give the floor to the god of the Milky Way, that they might give us insight into themselves and their followers. And we will offer advice and guidance, and welcome them among us, even if we determine that their time among us may be short. And in turn, we receive their words and their stated intent for what they wish to accomplish upon this day." Kurzuk stepped aside, and the human god glanced around himself, then stood and walked to the dais. He removed his helmet and held its wide brim against his chest as he began to speak. "I must first offer apologies to the esteemed beings gathered before me. There was something of a misunderstanding with the way that your invitation here was presented, but after much consideration, I decided to come and see for myself. Know that I cannot make any decisions on behalf of the Divine of the Milky Way. I am merely their messenger." "What is this?" bellowed Prelfrey immediately. Their mortals were, relatively speaking, close to the Milky Way, and they made no attempt to hide the imperial tone they took over what they saw as soon to be their latest dominion. "Does the human god somehow send a human to us?" The assembled gods peered below, where the human ambassador was now speaking before the Universal Council. "No," said Forquy, their long neck arcing back up. "This one is larger than the humans, if only just, and we can sense an air of the divine about him." "I am a god," said the human deity defensively, "and I am familiar with much of what you have spoken. I was once worshipped as one of a pantheon of gods. I was, as I am now, a messenger. But I also had responsibility over bringing souls to the afterlife." Kurzuk and many others nodded in agreement. Two things that don't, on the surface, belong together, but which come together over time. This god wasn't sharing anything revelatory, but perhaps he was simply happy to see that others had gone through what he had. "I was renamed, subsumed into another culture, and then saw the worship of myself and others fall out of favor, as monotheistic religions took hold." "Why do you speak of the monogod as another?" someone asked. Kurzuk recognized Ulfason, one such single god that had defeated some pantheons and absorbed others as she grew. Most of the gods assembled used a plural form of reference for themselves, but like Kurzuk himself, Ulfason identified as a single being first and foremost, in her case a mother figure. "Because he was," said the human god, shrugging. He played with the wingtips on his helmet as he kept talking. "He was known by one name to one group of people, and another name to another group. Later on, a third name, and much later a fourth. In his second incarnation, his followers were bent on converting everyone they could. The same could be said for the third, I suppose. The followers of my pantheon largely died or converted." "Who are you?" asked Kurzuk, frowning. He could no longer allow this newcomer to be so evasive. "Speak plainly. Who are you to stand before us, divine, and speak of this one god as someone else?" "Oh, I apologize," the god said. "My name is Hermes, and worship of me never fully went away, just abated. It came back later, before humanity took to the stars, and then even stronger afterward. But by that time we had met others. We knew of the god that stole our followers, but we met other cultures we could not have known in antiquity. I have met other messenger gods. I simply was chosen among all of them to be the one to come here."
"Wait," said Pwefui. "You mean to tell me that your gods have not been absorbed into one patron god of the galaxy?"
Hermes sighed, maybe annoyed at having to repeat himself. "Hardly," he said. "If anything, finding the stars allowed more space for worship to grow. That single god I spoke of before, if anything, he was split. The first group worshipped Yahweh, the second called him God, the third Allah, and the fourth Koat. All four worshipped on their own, and they may as well be four different monogods now, despite their common origin. In ancient times, I was worshipped as Hermes by one culture, and was later given the name Mercury, but now Mercury is an entirely other god of an independent pantheon that is worshipped separately from my own." He gestured widely, no longer appearing intimidated by the grandeur of those gathered. Indeed, if what he said was true, he might have found the number of those assembled to be rather pitiful by comparison. "I have regained my original name as worship of me returned. I am no less a true divine being than any of you here."
"Nonsense!"
Kurzuk scoffed. The other gods assembled had begun to talk incredulously among themselves, discussing if what Hermes was saying was even possible. "No god species that attains intergalactic travel maintains a pantheon of gods. Their worship wanes, and the gods merge to maintain strength." He clapped the halves of his polearms against the floor, and gestured with his large arm towards the assembled divinities. "That is simply the way of things." "Your sample size is hardly significant," Hermes said with a chuckle. "There are, 20 of you? 30?
"We are 33 in number," Kurzuk intoned darkly, "each with the full worship of an entire galaxy behind us."
The rest of the chamber was filled with an incredulous babble. "The diminished worship, you said so yourself." Hermes shook his head. "My pantheon features 12 Olympians. Before us are the 12 Titans. From us are descended dozens of demigods." The small god's voice dropped. "The Roman pantheon features similar numbers. The Norse pantheon numbers over 60. One by one, the other gods assembled stopped conversing among themselves as Hermes continued. "The Egyptian pantheon blurs the line between full deities and material spirits. Gods of the numerous cultures of the Americas numbered around 1,000, though again there are far more when it comes to spirits. Chinese gods number well over 1,000, and there are so many more belief systems that rose in times of urban antiquity."
"Surely not all of them survived,"
said Pwefui, trying to maintain his bluster.
"Surely your conquering religions wiped them out."
"Many, yes." Hermes held his helmet tighter to his chest with one hand. "And while many were able to come back, as I did, we do mourn the loss of countless gods. But alongside them we celebrate the new divinity that we found in space." "The gods of another species," said Lorum. She looked at her brother, Asvita, locking eyes with him. "In almost all galaxies, the religion of one conquers the other." "Only for us," Asvita replied, looking away from his lover and back to the human god. "Did the mythologies shift into a stable pattern of duotheism? The same cannot be said for the other half of the galaxies here, where more than one species was rising to dominance at the same time." "The gods of other species," said Hermes, nodding. "True, the Lurkum have a few dozen gods, and the Polodiv have a couple hundred. Humanity has the most, and rose to the stars first, so their culture of spirituality and tolerance for anyone to worship as they will kept their pantheons mostly intact. Sure, there were willing converts to human gods, but more humans converted to the novel pantheons that they met in the stars." He shook his head. "But that's not what I meant. I meant that, when humanity reached the stars, they also reached out for more gods. Whole new gods, given birth in the cosmos." He smiled. "Nobody prays quite so hard as someone who needs a rusted-out ship to make one last jump to port. Nobody gives thanks as much as someone whose whole world is a few hundred cubic meters, and their ship begins to exhibit a weak spirit that tries its best to protect its crew. Spirits!" he exclaimed. "All this talk of gods and no talk of spirits. A spirit of the deer, a spirit of a forest, a spirit of a hunt, a spirit of a ship, a spirit of a star, a spirit of a trade lane. Mother Nature is only one of many who have manifested post-antiquity to answer the prayers of supplicants. Tell me, he said, and gestured to Puefui, is someone praying to you now?
Of course, they replied. Millions at this very moment for all sorts of things.
And how effective are you at answering their prayers?
Quite effective, they said, puffing up their chest barbs. Of course I must weigh the needs of them as a whole, but I do more than many here.
Tell me then, is someone praying to you for good weather?
They are. I balance it against other prayers and the well-being of their city, but I grant what I can.
I'm sure you do. You are well practiced at it?
I absorbed the god Hexuf, who was a goddess of the sky, and all I know of weather I learned from her.
What were you god of originally?
Of war, they grinned. I dare say is my specialty.
Your specialty, Hermes nodded. Is someone praying to you for beauty? He asked softly.
Of course they are, Puefui chuckled. They always are.
Is someone praying to you for the right words as they compose a speech, or for a sense of calm before they step in front of a crowd to talk?
A few are, yes.
When someone in the Milky Way wants good weather, they may pray to Zeus, or to Freya, or to Huracan, or to Bunzi. For good fortune in war, my fellow Olympian Ares will answer the call, but so will Caturix, Kratos, and Anat. His voice grew soft. Anat will also answer prayers of beauty and fertility, like my dear Aphrodite. And if someone wishes their messenger a swift and safe journey, I am among those to whom those wishes are addressed, along with the likes of Thoth and Narada. I also, if you will allow the self-aggrandizement, specialize in oration. He smiled, looking out at the crowd. When was the last time any of you specialized in a field? Studied it? Made it a core piece of your being, at the expense of other fields? How effective are you really when a scared child, shuffling paper in their hands, has to speak in front of their class for the first time? The hall was finally silent. Hermes continued quietly. The Christian God has decreed that saints are not divine, but people still pray to St. Christopher for safe passage, and so a spirit has manifested to grant those wishes. They need to. With so many followers, one god cannot do it all, so some people have expressly turned to polytheism, so that someone is always listening to their specialized prayer. He sighed and shrugged, his voice still low. And many will pray to whoever is listening. From the humblest of prayers to the greatest of the elder gods, we share divine space with so many entities. Humans can and will pray to anything. They follow any sort of devotion they wish, even if they know for a fact that it is of fictional origin. An old story gave birth to an energy that now binds the galaxy for some of its followers, and I have already spoken the name of a god who originally was just a protagonist in a story, created and sold for profit in an information age. He gestured wide to the assembly, which by now was feeling much smaller than they had been at the start of the session. All of us were created by our worshippers, he declared, his voice finally gaining presence again. Go back far enough and you find the first small tribe that called you into existence. There is no reason that cannot continue. He shook his head. I pity you, all of you. I pity that your species do not have the will to create anymore, as they did when they were gathered around campfires. I pity that they do not believe enough to sustain a full pantheon.
We do not need your pity, Puefui spluttered. We have become who we are through strength and power.
They rose and stepped down towards the podium. Kurzuk should have stopped them, but his opinion of the tiny divine in front of them was unsure. He felt insulted, but also awed of what he represented, and so he met Puefui's approach with only inaction.
I should smite you where you stand for daring to speak such foolishness in front of us. The fact that you stand here alone and not as an entire god means that your species is backwards, that it is stunted, that it has not progressed as all mortals should, to a single divine.
Smite me if you wish, Hermes said. He donned his helmet somberly. The wings on the sides flared, and Kurzuk thought he caught a flicker of wings on his sandals as well. If you can, The worst case scenario is that you manage to do so.
Worse for you, maybe,
Pwefri reared up, raising their two front arms and bringing their hands together. Worse for you. He looked around the hall as Pwefri hesitated. For all of you, do you know nothing of martyrs? Do you know nothing of the retribution that a people feel when one of their own is taken from them? My fellow Olympians would mourn my death, as would my fellow divine messengers. He tilted his head down and glared at Pwefri along the brim of his helmet. Does this august body not recognize the immunity of messengers, or is that a failing of you alone? Let the small god live, said Fokui. They were the only one that was paying close attention to the assembled mortals in the plain below. He speaks truth. You tell us that you are a god of oration? I am. I must commend you, then, on your stirring speech here while also guiding your mortals. They seem to be quite persuasive in their own right. I had thought that I knew oration, they said, extending a leg to Kurzuk. But what I see now is beyond impressive. Kurzuk peered onto the mortals and saw that Fokui was right. The Milky Way delegation, led by the humans, was different from the delegations of other galaxies, as had held true in such meetings with new species in the past. The established galaxies sought to disparage them for their differences, to take advantage of the newcomers. But unlike previous times that they had welcomed a new intergalactic species, things were going differently. The humans had waited until now to reveal a truer source of power that was beyond what the other mortals gathered could fathom. Kurzuk felt his own mortal's emotions, rolling in similar patterns to his own. I would like to take credit for that, Hermes replied to Foku with a shake of his head. But they did not pray to me. They prayed to Ogma, who provided their ancestors with writing and poetry. He looked back to Pwefri, still ready to destroy Hermes where he stood, still hesitating but not yet standing down. Smite me if you must, and face the consequences. And I shall return. Perhaps a great tale told of me being brought back from Hades, like Balder and Osiris. Or perhaps they will just keep praying and I will manifest again as if nothing happened, as though your action had no consequence at all. No consequence to me, at least. As for the consequence that you shall face should you attempt to destroy me, well, I just expect that my half-brother would have something to say about that. Space behind Hermes distorted, and a similarly small god stepped out from behind him, clad in a cloak and a skirt made of multiple leather strips. One hand held the haft of an enormous sword, whose weight was mostly resting on his shoulder.
Trouble?
He asked in a deep rumble. Maybe. Did you bring some friends, Ares? Ares smiled, a wicked grin that split his dark face.
I brought all of them.
The air ripped again, and another god stepped out. Then another, and yet another. Some wore clothes similar to those of Hermes and Ares, but most wore dress in a wider variety than the assembled gods had ever seen. Cloaks, jumpsuits, power armor, nothing at all. Dozens upon dozens of gods filled the dais, the abstract space becoming larger to accommodate them. Humans have become tolerant of worship that is not their own, Hermes said, standing beside Ares at the forefront. But they were not always like this. Even now they find many things to fight about. Gods of war are among the most numerous in our stars. So ask yourself, and make sure your mortals consider the question just as carefully. Do you really want to anger an entire galaxy that needs over 100 war gods?